I'm Tom Strange, and we're at the Sigel Music Museum. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the English grand piano, its action, and we're going to hear from the 1845 Broadwood grand piano that's in the collection. A piano that Chopin himself once played for one of those morning concerts he was doing in the spring of 1848. So when we say the English grand piano, I think it would be natural to ask, well, what does that mean? What is the difference between an English grand piano and all others? One of the wonderful things that we'll be able to bring to you going forward is that we now have, with the acquisition of the Sigel collection of musical instruments, we have some wonderful instruments from Germany, from Augsburg and Vienna. We have the English grand pianos that were already part of the collection, plus some additional ones, and we have some very early Erards, so we can kind of trace what happened with the English grand piano, because it's not really just one thing. But specifically what we're talking about is an action that looks very much like this one here. And here's the key lever, here's a jack, and here's our hammer on the shank, and when I push down on the key lever, as you see, the jack comes up and it hits the butt of the shank and brings up the hammer on its pivot. And so this actually works very, very well. The action is extremely light, and the hammers are not very heavy on these pianos. So it's only a couple of layers of leather. And then the whole thing itself is no more than about 5/8 of an inch in diameter in the deep bass. So an instrument where an action like this works really, really well. If you'll notice, to the side here, we have this stick of wood that's moving up and down. That's the damper for this. Here's one of those, and it looks very much like a harpsichord jack. It's a little smaller than a traditional harpsichord jack would have been, but it runs and guides just like a harpsichord jack would have had. And of course, thinking back at the time, the harpsichord is in full bloom, and everybody is building along those lines. So if you needed a damper mechanism for a piano, why not use something like a harpsichord jack? This would be traditionally used up until the 1820s, when the wire-guided dampers began to take over, being a little simpler to build and smoother in action. If I come around to the side, here is a modern piano action, and the first thing you'll notice is it looks considerably more complicated. It solves one of the big problems that the regular English action has. So here is the jack here. We now have some mechanical advantage. As I press on the key, it sets this entire weapon into motion, and the jack comes up and it hits the butt of the hammer shank right here and drives it up. But you'll see this lever right through here. That lever is called the repetition lever, and that's really important, because what it allows us to do is, without the hammer coming all the way down, I can then restrike and I can repeat without having to go all the way to the base of the key and then back up again. So a neat invention. Erard is actually credited with inventing this. It was rapidly adopted by Steinway, Chickering, Canabi. Today, all modern pianos look very much like this, because this is an action that works great. So this tells you a little bit about the English action. The layout of the piano is largely the same as what we would find in even a German piano of the same time. German pianos typically made less use of overspun string in the bass early on. In particular, they used solid wire. The English pianos had solid wire up until the 1830s, and then the overspun becomes fairly common, and it's used ever since then. The overspun allows you to have a somewhat richer bass with a shorter string. It does add a little bit to the inharmonicity problem, but that's easily solved through accurate tuning. I think it's always important to actually hear what these pianos sound like, rather than just see something dry like the action. I want to introduce Beth Lee. Beth is a pianist, graduate of the Juilliard Conservatory, and a co-founder of this museum. So I'm going to tell you briefly about this piano. This is an 1845 Broadwood grand piano. This was their full grand piano. We often refer to this particular model as the Chopin Grand because it has the gadrooned edge, and this was the model that was chosen when Chopin came to England to tour in 1848. He was given two of these, one of which survives. It's at Hatchlands with Alec Cobb, and that's one of the ones that he actually toured with. But while he was there, he would be playing these morning concerts in late April and May to make a little money. For consideration of 20 guinea, he would come to your house and he would play for a couple of hours. And the records show that this piano was one of the pianos that he played when he was at the Amory House sometime in May of 1848. So a wonderful instrument. It's a little bit of a Rosetta Stone. When the last daughter died, the piano was closed up and put into a downstairs room in 1923, and there it sat until 2012 when the house was sold and the piano had to be sold, and I bought it at auction. It was the dirtiest piano I had ever seen, but I wanted one of these that was like the Chopin had toured with. It was only later, after the auction, that we found out the provenance on this and the Chopin connection. But as I began to clean this thing up, I was amazed. The condition under all that dust and dirt was nearly pristine. So what you're hearing is a piano with original strings, with original hammer coverings. The bugs didn't get into it. The rodents didn't get into it. The water didn't get to it, and the piano technicians didn't get to it. So it's been pretty much left alone. We've voiced the hammers a little bit, and otherwise what you're going to hear is something of a snapshot of 1848. So Beth, let me turn it over to you.
Okay. All right. Well, I just appreciated the opportunity to be involved with this museum and with Tom and Deborah, and we've all kind of shared a vision that it seemed like very few people have had. So we're all learning as we go, and especially me. My background is in playing music, and none of this information was ever presented in music school. Maybe it will be now, or has been since I was in school, which was a long time ago. But to me, these pianos are living, breathing things. When people view them, they may think they're a piece of furniture. The ivory is real, the ebony is real, the wood is real. They were living and breathing things from centuries before we were living and breathing things. So they have a life to themselves, and each one is unique. The builders and the restorers of these instruments, I think, have to look for consistency and evenness in the way the keys fit, the way they fit all of the various pieces of the action and the strings and the body. Everything needs to be somewhat consistent, and that's what we need. But then it's the pianist's job to take the consistency and turn it into something that breathes music. And our only access to that is really through the keys, unless, they're contemporary composers who are going to go strike those strings, but Chopin was not one of them. So the action, as Tom has described, is the heart and soul of everything that happens between the keys and the whole rest of the instrument. That's all we might have control over. And the way we have to control it is with our fingers. Modern pianists and pianos both are trained somewhat to play to the bottom of the key. As Tom has described the action, the bottom of the key is rather light for this particular piano. So it's not getting the same resistance that I might be used to on a Steinway. I have further to go, but because I've worked at having fingers that do that, it's more what I'm used to. And you would really have to spend quite a bit of time working on any of our wonderful historic keyboards that are here in order to determine the uniqueness of what you're hearing versus what you're playing. By playing to the bottom of the key, you hope to aspire to bring a variety of sounds to the same piece of now plastic covering of a key, to make it warm or cold, dark or light, all the louds and softs, all the various elements that go into creating an emotional perception of the music you're playing, we have to control from right here. And how much control we have over that is what it's all about, which is through the action. So I chose a little bit of a Raindrop Prelude by Chopin as one of his signature pieces, just an excerpt. I think there's more information we'll hear more about in terms of the repeating mechanism, because this one has so many repeated notes which are supposed to resemble raindrops. So perhaps we'll hear a little between light and dark, cold and warm. Maybe we'll hear wet and dry too, but I'm not so sure. When pianists start out learning, many of you would know if you've played the piano, you're going to be told to raise your fingers high. Perhaps you heard a little bit of an after sound in some of those keys. As you get a little better, then you get your fingers closer to the keys, it's more efficient. You can go faster and not have to move around quite so much. So you don't, are you getting fingers too, I guess? Okay. And then eventually you become more legato. You're told to, you don't play the next key until this one's up. And then staccato and everything between. So those are all elements of learning to play the scales and learning to adapt those to different pieces of music. But in reality, when we go to play this sort of thing, you strike the key, you drop the key, drop onto the key, you may push the key, you may twist the key when you're doing twists and turns. All of that, you hope, translates into an acoustical difference in the music that the composer has intended to reflect. I'm especially fond of mazurkas, even though I just kind of brought one with me today, which may or may not be familiar, because mazurkas are seldom heard in most concert venues because they were written to be intimate pieces in an intimate environment. And somebody gave me a book of them one time, and I thought, what fun this is. There were 52 mazurkas to work through. And despite the fact that they were note-wise not difficult to read, they became one of the most difficult of Chopin's works to interpret and to present because of the intimacy value. And we all know that a lot of the markings in all Chopin's music came about by various editors through many hundreds of years, and also Chopin himself, depending on where and when he played it and what he might have marked it himself. So anyway, this is just a little mazurka which captures the essence of this instrument maybe better than some others. I think that gets us to the lightness of the touch, which is another unique expression of mazurkas. They're all that way.
Well, one of the things that's important to note with these earlier pianos is that the total impedance is lower. The strings are not as big in diameter as our modern piano, and the soundboard is thinner. The soundboard on this piano is about 6.5 to 7 millimeters thick. On your Steinway at home, it's 10 to 12 millimeters thick. And so it's a heavier soundboard. This creates what the Steinway people talk about as the bloom. So you play the chord and the music blooms up. If you've ever struck a gong, you'll know that it's very, very pronounced in a gong. You hit the gong, you don't hear the greatest loudness right at first. The loudness must bloom out of the gong. The same thing is happening in a piano. The earlier the piano in general, the lower the impedance, and so the quicker the sound comes up and the quicker the sound can actually diminish with the smaller strings. One of the things that you would notice if we were to compare this 8-foot grand piano next to a 9-foot grand piano from Steinway is that the dampers are about half as big throughout the compass as they would be on your Steinway. This is intentional. The idea of the sound bleeding through just a little bit was something that the English builders seemed to favor, particularly in the early English grand pianos. I will say that the German pianos were built on a different concept. Their thought was as a damper it should damp, and so when you let up on the key, it damps just like that. The aesthetics finally caught up with the bleeding sound through, and so today with our dampers, when you let up on the key, it stops just like that. So a little bit that we took from the Germans. Once the sound is extinguished, throughout most of this, we won't hear anything else going on. But like all the pianos of this period, the dampers stop about 2/3 of the way up, and we let the rest of the strings just have a normal sustain. There is no duplex on this. There's no additional strings that are being asked to speak. They're essentially muting everything else out. So it makes for a fairly clean sound with a sparkly treble and a really satisfying tenor and bass. Because these are all original strings, I would just say that I think the lowest bass notes would probably be improved with new strings. They're overspun, they're iron on iron, and that's a very difficult metallurgy to keep going for hundreds of years. And so we've left them alone because we're a museum, and this is for study purposes as well as listening, and they're still fairly functional. Why don't you close us out with one more piece that you really like?
always look for a keyboard to sing, ring, or speak. If it doesn't do that, I don't care. But I think the people who rebuild these pianos too and have found them and played them through the centuries, that's what was driving them forward always. Our early harpsichords, clavichords, and harpsichords, if people couldn't hear them, then they had to do something to make them more, to give them more volume. Well, the same thing's been true over the last couple of 100 years too. We want more opportunity for expression. We want more variety of sounds within the way the hammer strikes the strings. And I think some companies have almost perfected that system now, and it's up to us to make the most of it. So thank you, Tom.
Beth, thank you very much. If you enjoyed today's program, if you would share it, we're going to post it on Facebook. If you'll share that out on your page, we would appreciate it. We're trying to get the word out about all the things that we're doing, and keep in mind that even though we have to kind of shelter in place and stay home for the most part, the museum as a concept is still alive, and we're going to keep coming to you Wednesdays and Fridays with live broadcasts, as well as on Instagram. We have something tomorrow with Ali Cade talking about the woodwinds, and then we're going to just continue to do this sort of on a personal basis to keep things going until we can all get back together again. Me remind you that during this time, fundraising has ground to pretty much a halt for all the nonprofits. So if there's a nonprofit of your choice that you would like to give to, now is a good time to give. Sigel Music Museum would love to have a contribution. Think about us if you would. Otherwise,
or sign up for a membership
or
at our website.
Sign up for a membership. Thank you very much. So I will close out by saying enjoyed having you here. Stay safe. On Friday we will have Maria Perini on piano and her cellist friend. They're going to be here to play for us on the Erard 1863. So really a wonderful transitional English piano. Erard building both in Paris and London. We have pianos from both places, but we have a wonderful London piano that you're going to hear on Friday. So thank you all very much, and we'll be back.